Thank you, William, for your introduction. Agradeço.
Tony and colleagues. Thank you to my colleagues on the panel, and a special thank you to Seacole. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and show you a PowerPoint. Okay, so William already gave the introduction. My presentation today is called The COVID Impact on the African Diaspora in the United States and in Black Europe. And my colleagues are going to talk more about the United States than myself. And my goal is to provide an overview of Black Europe to give you a contrast with the United States, because it's much easier to obtain information on the United States than it is on Black Europe. The PowerPoint is available, and I'll ask colleagues at the Fabrica to share the PowerPoint. Okay. What I want to do today is to take a complex situation and make it simple, to take complicated things and make them simple, and to take simple things and make them complicated. I'll talk briefly about the United States and then Black Europe. And what I want to do is to recognize differences across each region, as well as similarities. And I'll argue that the differences and the similarities exist alongside one another. And whether the differences or the similarities are the most important is a matter of choice and up to individual analysts. Okay. What we see with COVID in the United States is that its impact on Black people has been far worse than on white people and on other groups. And the impact has been worse because of the prior situation of racial inequality and gender inequality. COVID has made life for Black people far worse economically and far more difficult in case of health and healthcare. The Trump administration made racial inequality worse than it was before, although, as we know, racial inequality has existed for Black people and other people of color since the creation of the United States. And the main issue is that Black people do not have the resources to overcome racial inequality or to overcome the problems that we face in healthcare. The killing of George Floyd in 2020, the existence of the Black Lives Matter movement, led by several Black women many years ago after the killing of Trayvon Martin, these issues have led to far more discussion of race and racism in the public sphere, at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level. But this discussion of race and the identification of institutional racism has created a political and social backlash, a reactionary backlash. Powerful whites in politics refuse to discuss race. They have tried and partly succeeded to outlaw critical race theory and an analysis of racism, and they demand that there should be no mention of racism in universities, in schools, and in political debate. And some examples of people who are prominent on this position are former President Trump, senior Republican Mitch McConnell, and very recently, as an example, the governor of Oklahoma. And here, to give you an example, just 4 days ago, the governor of Oklahoma introduced a law to say that there should be no courses that require a focus on concepts of race. He said that no people today should be held responsible for actions of the past. He did not say white people, but it's clear that he meant white people should not be held responsible. His law also bans or prevents any form of mandatory gender or sexual diversity training or counseling. And then he argued that now, more than ever, we need policies that bring us together, not rip us apart. So there are many supporters of people like this who argue that any focus on racism or sexism is designed to rip us apart, which I believe is clearly a contradiction and does not match the facts. During all this time, Black resistance continues. Resistance is widespread, and Black Lives Matter is at the forefront. But Black Lives Matter is not the only area of resistance. There are widespread protests and campaigns across the entire country, from New York to Florida and from California to Washington. Okay. Protests in policing, in health, in housing, in voting, and other areas. And the federal government under Joe Biden has made a number of symbolic and some substantive or material responses. They are more prepared to talk about race, more prepared to introduce policies, and more ready to discuss racism. However, they seem to be not yet ready to discuss reparations for slavery. However, in California, just last week or 2 weeks ago, the governor established the first reparations committee at the state level in the United States. And my colleague, Jovan Scott Lewis, from the Department of Geography, is one of the members of that committee. Okay. That's all I want to say about the United States. Okay. I provided some readings, and my colleagues on the panel will say a lot more, and I welcome them to question or critique as they see appropriate any of the things that I've suggested. Okay. Let me turn now to Black Europe and to the African diaspora in Europe. This is a map that one of my students created to highlight the overwhelming concentration of Black people in just 12 countries in Europe. I'm not going to talk about the different categories. It's just to give you an idea of where Black people are in Europe. In summary, I argue that there are 46 nations in Europe. The United Nations says there are 52, but I think some of these nations are not typically recognized as part of Europe. So focusing on 46 nations in Europe, I've established that there are over 770 million people. And of that 770 million people, 7 million are Black, 7 million. And that's less than 1% of the entire population. And of those 7 million Black people, 90% of Black people live in 12 nations. And there you see the names of the nations. These are what I call the usual suspects, the obvious nations where we know that large numbers of Black people are located. I assume I'm not going too fast, Seacole. You can let me know if I am. When we look at the nations of Europe, we see what I call very distinct differences in the experiences and the numbers of Black people. So, for example, the United Kingdom has more than 2 million Black people, and France also has 2 million Black people. But Europe is far bigger than a geographical region because part of the Caribbean is officially in Europe, and the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe and also of Guyana are officially citizens of France. So 700,000 Black people in the Caribbean and South America are technically and officially in France. We see that 90% of Black people in Scandinavia are Muslim. They identify as Muslim or are identified. They mainly come from the Horn of Africa. Okay. We see the majority of Black people in Spain do not speak Spanish as a first language. There are Black people who speak Spanish as a first language. It's true. But there are very large numbers of Black people, Africans, from Franco-Africa, Francophone Africa. Okay. And we also see in Italy that a very large number of Black people are recent arrivals. So these differences are real and they have consequences. And many of the books that talk about Black people in Europe talk about these differences. However, I don't want to talk about the differences. What I would like to highlight is what I call 4 striking similarities, 4 very concrete similarities across Europe. And what I'm arguing is that an analysis of Black people within one country or within individual countries is insufficient to understand the Black diaspora in Europe. And that to understand the Black diaspora, one has to look at it as a European issue, a population that was created by European colonialism, imperialism, and migration. So these are the 4 similarities. So no matter if Black people live in Sweden or the United Kingdom or Portugal or Germany, they all share these 4 common elements. Let me look at each one. Ambiguous hypervisibility has 2 elements. The first element is that the majority of images of Black people in Europe are of Black people suffering at a disadvantage, creating crime. So we see images of immigrants, refugees, low-paid people. We see images of women as prostitutes, as sex workers, as cleaners. We see images of Black people unemployed and homeless. So overwhelmingly, the images are of Black people at a disadvantage. And we see very few images of Black people in business as chief executive officers, professors, researchers, medical doctors, or attorneys. Here's some examples of the images that we see of Africans trying to get into Europe, of African women stereotyped as Nigerian who are ascribed as prostitutes, and street vendors who don't have the papers to work. These are just a sample of some of the images. Okay. But the visibility is ambiguous because we also have images of people of Black people who are a success. You see Oprah Winfrey, Barack Obama, you see Usain Bolt, and these are all Black people outside Europe, because the most common image of successful Black people is of Black people outside Europe. Okay, but we also have images of successful Black people inside Europe. So you see Jessica Ennis Hill of the United Kingdom, Patricia Mamona of Portugal. There are lots of other Black women. They competed successfully for medals in the Rio Olympics. Okay, so this hyper ambiguous visibility is problematic because the only successful people in Europe, Black people that you see images of, are foreigners or they are in sport. And I call this a social cocoon, a narrow stereotypical representation of Black success. So that's number 1, visibility. Number 2 is vulnerability, otherwise known as inequality. So it is a fact that Black people face widespread inequality in politics, economics, business, medicine, and health. We see men in the worst jobs, unemployed, homeless. We see women in the so-called caring professions, low paid, part-time, sex work. In other words, when you look at the facts of inequality in Europe, there isn't a single area where Black people are doing better than any other group, except in social protest. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So we have images of inequality and the facts of inequality. Okay. Here's an example. In Europe, 3 years ago, when I collected the data, we find that in the 12 nations that I looked at, actually more than 12, there are 4,200 politicians at the national level. 4,200 at the national level. And out of that, only 22 are Black. Only 22 are Black. And 18 of these are in England. Now, I should let you know that some of these have changed. 2 of these women have gone. 2 new women, 3 new women are there. But you get the idea. Extreme inequality at the national level. However, I should say, there is a lot of political activity by Black people at the city level and far more at the community level. In other words, we are underrepresented at the national level, but very highly represented in community politics. Okay. A third issue, COVID and race in Europe. So the situation in Europe was bad before COVID, and COVID has made it worse. There's been an adverse impact on Black lives, represented at the extreme in illness and death. Black people have been more impacted than many other groups, although healthcare in Europe is far better than in the United States in general, and especially is available for the poor. But the healthcare systems from Italy and Spain to Germany and the UK are overwhelmed. And many of these systems do not provide healthcare unless you are a citizen. So we see differences from Northern Europe, which is richer, than Southern Europe, which is poorer. Okay. Oh, that went with inequality. I'm sorry. So that was still number 2. Okay. Number 3, in terms of common issues across Europe, is what I call irrepressible resistance. So no matter the inequality, no matter the discrimination, no matter the racism, Black women and men continue to resist, continue to protest, continue to be active to make European nations more equitable, more socially just, to create opportunities for their families and for everyone. And Black people and others also continue to produce knowledge outside the academy, outside universities, to question the significance of colonialism, of imperialism, and of racism and sexism today. And these activities, this resistance, has increased and become broader since the killing of George Floyd in the US. The killing of George Floyd in the US has had a tremendous impact in the United Kingdom. So, for example, to give you some general issues, I'm just going to give you some examples of resistance. Operation Black Vote in England is one of the main reasons there are so many Black politicians in England, and there are not so many in other nations. Okay. Brigade Anti-Negrophobie in France challenges the refusal of the French government to talk about anti-Black racism in particular. Foja Organización is an Afrocentric Pan-Africanist organization in Madrid, in Spain, with branches across the nation. Okay. The Black Europe Summer School in Amsterdam is a 2-week program that focuses on the unique experiences of Black people as agents of social change and as victims of racism. Rather than treating Black people as a second category, Black people are at the center of the analysis. Plataforma Ghetto in Portugal brings together a range of poets and activists and performers and analysts to challenge racism in Portugal. There's also knowledge produced outside the academy because there are very few Black people inside universities in Europe. So people like Gus John, like Sandhu Hira, are producing books that focus on racism, that focus on sexism, that focus on the intersections of racism and sexism in ways that universities do not. There's also analysis in film. Fred Cuono is a Ghanaian Italian who produces documentaries and interviews and films about racism in Italy. In Denmark, Jeanette Ehlers and Laverne Bell have produced the first statue of a Black woman ever to appear in Denmark. About 2 years ago, I think it appeared. And Jeanette Ehlers also makes a range of videos and performances, which you can see on YouTube if you just go for her name. And here you see this image is an image that reflects the Black Panther Party and Huey P. Newton, who took a photograph sitting in this chair, a wicker chair, or in a similar chair. Okay. So to make complex things simple, what I'm arguing is that, like the United States, the impact of COVID in Black Europe exists today. It exists alongside institutional racism, which was already present in Europe. It exists alongside government denial of racism, because governments in Europe refuse to acknowledge racism. They say there is no racism in Europe, and they argue that racism is distinct to the United States. The COVID impact also exists alongside the celebration of European empires. So in the United Kingdom, the majority of people say the British Empire was a good thing. In France, the government says there was no racism. There was only liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And also there are nations in Europe that deny that they were ever involved in empire, like Sweden and Norway and Denmark. And we have the evidence to show it's untrue. In all of this, Black people continue to resist. What's happened exactly in the last 2 years? Here you see, after the killing of George Floyd, people mobilized in Britain. You see here a lot of white people with Black people to pull down a statue of Edward Colston. He was a very large slave owner and slave trader who bought and sold Africans for his profit. And there are many statues. Well, there's one main statue and many places named after him. And people said, we don't want to accept this any longer. Okay. At Oxford University, there was a statue to Cecil Rhodes, one of the most vicious imperialists in Africa. And people like Nathaniel Tobias Coleman had been demanding that that statue be removed. And Oxford University said no. Well, within a month after George Floyd was killed, that statue was removed and is currently in a warehouse as they make a decision what to do with it. Okay. There's also fears from the British government that statues of Winston Churchill, who was also a major imperial politician, will be attacked. And the government has put a lot of resources into protecting statues of Churchill. And then here you see the government has reacted very recently by saying it's time to stop complaining about the British Empire. It's time to celebrate Britain and the flag, the Union Jack. And here you see Kemi Badenoch, who is a Black British woman, a member of the Conservative Party, who gave a speech against critical race theory. And there you can read it. Critical race theory regards my Blackness as victimhood and whiteness as oppression. And she says that the government is against critical race theory. This is a challenge to the freedom of speech in universities and schools. And it's also a very gross misrepresentation. Also, a couple of months ago, a report was produced, commissioned by the government, that argued there was no institutional racism in Britain. Okay, this is contrary to all the evidence that shows widespread racism in Britain, including government evidence. And here you see some of the images of people of color who were on that campaign. As you see, there's a white person too. This is not everybody, But this is designed to show that just having Black people involved in analysis on its own is not enough. But I think people in Brazil already understand that, as we do in the United States. So, in other words, there's been a backlash from the government, from many white people, but Black people insist that alongside COVID, racism is also a pandemic. I have about 5 minutes left, so I'll bring it to an end. Black people fight against statues and museums, but Black people in Europe, and I give examples here from Britain, also have our own monuments. Okay, but our monuments are not statues, they are not museums, but they are community organizations, they are exhibitions, they are Black arts and cultural associations that are designed to challenge a colonized history and a colonized education, designed to put Black people at the front of analysis instead of being ignored, and designed to create a more comprehensive education, a more inclusive education, okay, and one that is not biased. In addition, across Europe, actually, this is just some more examples where I'm calling Black monuments. These are books produced by Black women and men. You see also the Small Axe television series, recently produced by Steve McQueen, which you may have heard of, and a number of films and music. These are just some examples. And then I give you some examples across Europe, okay? People producing books, mainly Black people, but also a lot of white people that challenge the idea that there is no racism in Europe. In other words, Black people do not remain silent. Okay. So to bring it to a conclusion, what I've tried to do is to make complicated things simple and simple things complex. There are many differences across each region, but there are many similarities too. Okay. And they exist alongside one another. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier in the presentation is that within the Black population in the US and in Europe, there are important class differences, and there are important gender differences, and there are also important differences in citizenship. Okay, so this means that while Black people confront these common obstacles, there are also differences by class, gender, nationality, and I would suggest also by religion. And whether the differences or the similarities in the experiences are more important is a matter of choice. This is a recent book by Akwugo Emejulu and Francesca Sobande, To Exist is to Resist. Então, obrigado a todos, muito obrigado, and thank you for your attendance.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigada, professora Stephen Small, pela brilhante explanação.
Thank you, Professor Stephen Smalls. I thank you for sharing this information with us. And now I'm inviting Professor John Collins. Professor John Collins is a PhD, holds a PhD from Michigan University since the 90s. He's been running ethnographic research about cultural landscapes at UNESCO and restoration programs and its relationships with national histories and political histories of Brazil. He's the author of the book, The Revolt of the Saints, Memory and Redemption in Racial Democracy in Brazil. Aside from his work about heritage, race, and ethnographic approaches to history and historicity in Latin America, he's currently involved in two projects. Under English Eyes, which examines how Africans who have come last here in coming to Salvador Bahia have experienced transition periods in Brazil in the 19th century to the so-called free labor. And the second is an incursion in the politics of property in North America. He seeks to understand recent economic changes that have changed the landscape in such a way that affects both national politics and the ecology of forests in North America. This project is closely linked to a close examination of imperial policies of North America, which has to do with Carol Graham. Is a co-edited book
pela Duke University Press,
called Ethnographies of U.S. Empire, published in 2018 and 2000, between 2012. He directs the program for Latin American studies in Queens College. In this program, he's got a very key project, both as a neighborhood, as a college. Thank you, Professor Collins.
Me mudar para inglês, já que eu sei que estou em boas mãos com nossa tradutora. Eu agradeço muito a Raquel. I also thank Livio and Angela and Professor Stephen for allowing me to appear on this panel with you. It's truly a pleasure to be talking about some of my work in the United States in relation to colleagues from around the world, as well as students and colleagues from Bahia. So I look forward to our debates. Let me begin. I will first share my screen. Okay. Let me begin by saying that I'd like to begin with an anecdote before the anecdote that begins my paper. And it has to do with a place called Hillbilly Hall and who I am and what the goal of this paper is. The goal of my paper today is to move away from large abstractions like populism, fascism, make America great again, and to look ethnographically at the emotions and the effects that divide us, that provide us with points of pivot to separate ourselves out, whoever we are, and hence to make us who we are. So let me begin by saying who I am. I could not do this research, and I could not do this research if I were not a large white man. I'm almost 2 meters tall. I live in New York City, mas eu sou meu bicho do mato, and I always have been. I have long been a naturalist, a conservationist. But over the last years, I have become a hunter, and I have done so with people who are quite different from me. So opening this up, about 2 years ago, I was sitting in Hillbilly Hall. Hillbilly Hall is a bar on the top of a mountain. It might be translated as Sítio Caipira, Recanto dos Caipira, or in Bahia, Boteco do Tabaréu. So standing at that bar, and of course, a tabaréu, a country person, a redneck, in the United States is white. Standing at that bar full of large white men like myself, somebody began to malign Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is the closest politician, I would say, very different given the national context, but to someone like Marielle before she was assassinated in Brazil. And they started to attack her viciously. And I had a few drinks in me, so I stood up and defended her. And these were people who frightened certain of my colleagues, and I was a little bit frightened by my own bravery. And I saw all the jaws around me just drop. They dropped. And I noticed then that people sort of looked at me and nodded their heads. 1 second before, they had been attacking Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Puerto Rican descended woman who espouses what is in the US passes for leftist politics and who is a congresswoman from close to me in New York City. And I found that I had earned a grudging respect people who had no intention to take her seriously, in fact, said foul, racist, gendered, vile, violent, and sexist things about her, all of a sudden began listening to me. And this is the moment that I'm trying to get to here by thinking about deer and death. The moment when politics no longer makes sense in relation to standard categories. The moment when we pick up affects of groups who supposedly we don't belong to and don't belong to us. And how that occurs in relation to the practices of overwhelmingly white and working or lower middle class petty bourgeois men in New Jersey, which is the most densely populated state in the United States, but has substantial rural regions. Here's a map which will show you where New Jersey is. On the left is where I'm working, which is Hunterdon County, it's called. And so let me begin. In August of 2020, a group of mostly working class white men met to discuss a pressing problem in a public park located in central New Jersey, just north of where General George Washington crossed the Delaware River to attack British forces on Christmas Day in 1776, in what would become one of the most decisive battles of the North American Revolution. Park officials had informed those in attendance that the wooded northeastern side of what I will call Pine Mountain, that they knew as Zone C, had been allotted to a group of 10 new hunters in the white-tailed deer management program in which they participated. This program is designed to limit deer populations due to their negative effects on the park's plant life. The official said, "We got such an overwhelmingly response this year that we had to reserve Zone C for new people." I don't know if people are concerned about food shortages now in the pandemic, or they simply have more time on their hands with unemployment and coronavirus, but we had so many people who wanted to hunt this year. In response, the long-term established participants in the program began to grumble about freedom and hunters' rights because Zone C offered excellent late season terrain. Previously, officials had reserved this area as an extra space where hunters might take an extra deer. This is how we hunt on Pine Mountain, up in chairs put up in the trees. And so people were allowed to have an extra chair there. This facilitated the hunters' meeting of the quotas that were necessary to remain in the program. In other words, one must kill a certain number of deer each year at the demand of the state in order to have access to public land. One hunter, a restaurant supply salesman from the suburban Trenton, which is the capital of New Jersey, who had found himself unemployed during the pandemic, he reported, "With the coronavirus, I was really counting on Zone C to knock down a few deer for the freezer. Forget bucks or the male deer. This coronavirus thing is turning me into a meat hunter." The issues of citizens' rights and obligations as they relate to the killing of deer on public lands around a symbolic site and a key animal in US history and national mythology lies at the core of my presentation. I am interested in killing and thus violence as a component of participation in US politics, particularly as related to conceptions of freedom and obligation. Although I'm not yet able to offer a fully synthesized argument about the role of the killing of animals in understanding the mainly male, overwhelmingly white, rural, and working class hunter support of recently defeated Donald Trump and his America First program, in what follows, I do attempt to chart an ethnographic path into understanding how specific forms of violence play a role in this political philosophy, and not simply specific forms of violence, but the affective states that accompany them. In doing so, I refuse the simple position that violent, imperialistic, white supremacist North American men simply like to kill innocent creatures because they are themselves the children of and support a violent, imperialistic, xenophobic nation. In doing so, nor do I imagine that I know what violence is and does. Most importantly, I refuse to take these people's killing of animals as evidence of some essential savagery, some deplorable lack of civilization and judgment, as candidate Hillary Clinton pronounced in reference to Trump supporters during the 2016 US presidential contest. But like my colleague ethnographer Anand Pandian, who remarks of right-wing protesters in Tennessee, he says that the hunters with whom I work, like the people with whom Anand work, their politics is pitched to shield vulnerable bodies from existential threat, one where protection and aggression are bound tightly together. History indicates that a politics of vulnerability, when taking the form of efforts to cordon off others and draw interior frontiers through ethno-nationalism, may fall quickly into fascism or something akin to the Third Reich. Yet it would be an oversimplification to characterize a majority of the Trump supporters I have met hunting as fascist or even populist. On the contrary, they are complex, often highly moral and ethical human beings who identify and disidentify with a panoply of political groups. But what, in my experience, what does unite them is a tight bundling of protection, generosity, and aggression. I'm interested in what most of my anthropological peers and a majority of my neighbors in New York City understand as the brutality and violence of hunting, and how this ties into broader collective forms of violence that hunters link in turn to their fundamental natural rights, and thus to conceptions of freedom. I'm also interested in how the brutality and violence of killing deer ties into collective forms of care and community that rest on giving and sharing rather than taking life. But before exploring further the theoretical bases and ethnographic interactions on which this paper is based, please allow me to present a quick overview of deer hunting in the region under discussion today. It would not be far-fetched to argue that the United States has been constructed around Odocoileus virginianus, the white-tailed deer. Not only was the animal a key source of protein for hungry colonialists, as it has long been for Native Americans, but the animal's ubiquity, tasty meat, and rich pelts influenced the transformation of buck, or the term for a male deer, into the common slang as applies to the US dollar. If in contemporary Portuguese, conto harkens back to the colonies and Iberian kings, then one buck in the US today recalls animals, frontiers, and the territorial expansion by hunters so essential to national expansion and imaginaries. As should be clear, US mythology is substantially reliant on the figure of the deer, as suggested by the globalization of Bambi by Walt Disney Studios, or the importance of deer hunting in the writings and life of one of the architects of US manifest destiny and imperialism, President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. My field research takes place on Sourland Mountain, a 70 square mile region of the Appalachian foothills prized for its forests, rocky landscapes, and wetlands. It is 40 miles north of Philadelphia and 70 miles southwest of New York City. In other words, it is at the center of the oldest part of the US, of the original 13 colonies. It is less than an hour by car from the US's largest city. Sorry, it is just over an hour and less than an hour by car from Philadelphia, one of the other large cities. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the US. It also presents some of the highest concentration of deer and the fastest rates of exurban growth. So what you have is a beautiful region which was once working class and is today being turned from an area of woodcutters, small farmers, industrial workers, into a place where lawyers, doctors, financial executives, advertising executives may buy a piece of beautiful woodland and telecommute to their jobs, as we are doing today. One of the most glaring results of the socioeconomic change in the region, from small-scale farms to wealthy exurbia, has been the explosion in the deer population. It has gone from what is estimated to be 10 animals per square mile when the Europeans arrived to well over 100 per square mile today. The result is, if you look at this forest, this may look nice to you, but it's actually almost all invasive plants. The forest itself can no longer regenerate. This forest should look like this. You can see that the understory, the lower plants, are very, very different. This is a result of the deer. It is why they invite hunters to hunt on what the park that I am calling Pine Mountain. Given this oversupply of deer, we now have many rural families, and especially the few remaining working families, who are able to obtain most of their family supply of meat through deer hunting. In other words, only about 100 kilometers from New York City, working class people may live off the land as hunters and gatherers. I know several families with children who meet almost all their food needs by hunting deer and birds, fishing, and gathering fruits and mushrooms. Here, subsistence economies come home to the United States and its working class white population. This is one reason that the management program, hunting program I mentioned in opening this paper, is so important to local hunters. They are searching for meat and not simply trophies. Deer bodies fill working people's freezers. Meanwhile, locals who are financially better off and do not want to consume their deer participate in programs like Hunters Helping the Hungry, a non-governmental organization that collects deer from hunters, pays to have the animals butchered, and then distributes the meat to the poor via local food banks. Significantly, among the primary recipients of the hunters' caloric excess are undocumented Latin American workers employed on farms and in construction in the region. Thus, the traditional hunting activities of US citizens who typically advocate very forcefully for the limiting of immigration and the rapid deportation of undocumented workers ends up feeding precisely those workers. Hunters see no problem with this apparent contradiction. As one told me, to share the beauty of the deer and the bounty of the earth is the Christian thing to do. It would seem that deer meat and sharing trump identity documents and pronouncements about legal and illegal status, at least at certain affective levels. Perhaps the effective charge of killing and butchering overcomes the political evaluation of insider and outsider status. This next section of my paper is called From Freedom and Xenophobia to Ethical Futures and Coevolution. Donald Trump and his followers advocate an America First policy. This position seems a powerful entailment of long-term currents of US nativism and racist expansion in imperial growing economic insecurity, and fears of white replacement by non-white, non-citizens and citizens. This has been exacerbated even further by the global coronavirus pandemic. Over the course of my 2 years of fieldwork among rural and exurban deer hunters, I've been shocked repeatedly by the depth of anger against government, fear of sexual, ethno-racial, and religious, in other words, non-Christian, difference, as well as misogyny. Those orientations toward what hunters consider a non-white, non-Christian, non-capitalist, and non-heteronormative world, coupled with what hunters describe as a pragmatic, non-interventionist, live and let die national politics. This involves so-called individual responsibility and freedom to do what one wants. This ostensible freedom is insistently backed up by specific readings of the US Constitution, especially as concerns the ownership of firearms, free speech, and what seems a neoliberal as well as longstanding rural North American emphasis on individual responsibility. One of the principal, albeit quotidian, and almost entirely uncommented upon by the media, political pundits, and social scientists, areas of my fieldwork interlocutors, discussions of responsibility and rights involves hunting meat and thus the ethics of killing, consuming, and fostering animals. These people's insistence that hunting is indeed violent, if nonetheless beautiful, natural, and traditional, that requires the hunter to face death and thus responsibility for his own life and the life of others. seems a key component of their assemblage of political positions and affective dispositions. It's what leads me to suggest that understanding how conservative, nativist-leaning hunters of deer approach the animals and their sport may provide important insights into the grounds of a US politics increasingly divided between conceptions of right and wrong and fiction. Over the course of my research, which has meant that after a lifetime of conservation advocacy and low-key opposition to hunting, I obtained my license and began hunting actively in 2019. I have encountered very few hunters who admit to liking to kill. Nonetheless, all mark the kill as the climax of the hunt, and thus a pregnant, liminal moment of inversion and potential renewal. I have spoken to even fewer hunters who deny the violence of that life-changing kill. Some become somewhat accustomed to the emotion of the moment, and all seem to naturalize the action in various ways. But the majority insist that they are continuously affected in some powerful way. This may involve physiological reactions, heightened states of sensory awareness, greater concern for deer as a species, zealous care of meat and an inability to waste it, and the circulation of meat across gift networks, as what I've argued elsewhere is a form of atonement or even sacrificial exchange. Rare is the hunter who denies the violence of the kill and thus of hunting. However, recent anthropological theorizations of human and non-human interactions and thus of what are in the resultant anthropological analysis presented as proper or desired interactions between different life forms and forms of life. These interactions, from an anthropological perspective, almost entirely rely on calls for an ethical opening, for a nonviolent recognition of shared affect and co-constitution of supposedly different beings. In North America, much of this analysis has been inspired by the path-breaking work on companionship and companion species by science studies theorist Donna Haraway. In this not quite utopian literature, hopes for the sustainable futures of a threatened planet are seen to emanate from sustained and intimate relations between life forms that, in light of this intimate and mutualist type of interaction, and the creative pedagogies that bring the interaction into being, come to be recognized as holding some sort of moral or social equivalence. Humans and non-humans, entangled as opposed to different in terms of nature and culture. Respect then gives rise to positive futures that increase the potential for survival of us all. In this world, humans should not simply bear down metabolically to exploit a prone nature, but instead recognize that humans and non-humans are companions who have been bifurcated artificially by a troubling, enlightened nature-culture divide. In this somewhat post-environmental positioning, salvation emanates not from setting aside landscapes and species, protecting them, but from interacting with them in the correct way, and as Haraway says, staying with the trouble. But what does it mean to interact correctly in a capitalist world? More pointedly, do the men with whom I hunt interact with the capitalist world in the same way that I do, or Bill Gates does? The answer is a clear no, just as the peasants and recently freed slaves who comprised Brazil's late 19th century Canudos rebellion certainly did not interact with a capitalist world in the same way that plantation owners or urban workers did. It is significant that the people of Canudos, like the people with whom I am working now, were referred to as something like deplorables by residents of the urban centers. Today, New Jersey hunters, made familiar with the instrumentalization of violence during tours of military duty and facing unemployment, multicultural initiatives that they understand as a threat to their heritage and symbolic as well as economic position, as well as a pandemic overseen, or they claim, even fostered by government experts that they do not trust. These people call for creative forms of political dissent. Central to this project is a disengagement from government control and even the markets that they nonetheless support ideologically. The disengagement from government is coupled with an engagement with natural landscapes as instrumentalized sources of individual sustenance. Here, forests replace supermarkets and farms. Families and friends circulate honey, mushrooms, deer, rabbits, and firewood, and dream of acquiring enough land so as to be not bothered while harvesting their food on their own private property. Meanwhile, according to scholars like Haraway and anthropologist Anna Tsing, living in the ruins of capitalism during a moment of climate crisis and pandemic calls for creative, effective forms of ongoing bricolage. Again, this bricolage involves a positioning through which people may open themselves to the non-human other, interacting ethically as a function of attention to our entanglements, or the forms of co-constitution on which humans may recognize themselves as kin to goats, to meerkats, or even to landscapes and mountains. Central to such arguments about co-shaping of humans and non-humans and stewardship of shared environments is an ethics of care rather than exploitation.
Excuse me, I believe the Raquel channel is down. Professora Raquel, por gentileza, você pode verificar o seu canal?
Ou se quiserem, posso ir tentando falando em inglês, em português, traduzindo enquanto ela ajeita isso, para não perder tempo de debate.
Ok, pronto. Muito
Tá.
obrigado, professor.
Aí me avisem quando a Raquel voltar, porque ela vai fazer bem melhor do que eu.
Ok, obrigado.
Okay. Em outras palavras, me parece que os caçadores violam os conceitos principais de uma política de atenção, de cuidar, mesmo que eles se integram com o outro não humano, quer dizer, o animal. Então, me parece importante notar que um número grande de antropólogos já notaram o tanto que cuidar, a ideia de zelar para os outros, se baseia numa série de exclusões, ou até formas paternalísticas de violências e medidas coercivas, que são bem aparentes. Então, a próxima sessão chama-se zelo violento. O zelo do meio ambiente é básico ao ambientalismo tradicional. Zelo para os outros não humanos, ou até o engajamento com eles como iguais ou co-conspiradores, em vez de fontes de carne e trabalho para serem colonizados pelo ser humano, é central ao post-ambientalismo teorizado por pensadores como Haraway e Tsing. Porém, os caçadores me indicam que eles também participam em laços afetivos e de zelo com os servos, os veados. Eles conhecem bem, na intimidade, esses servos. Muitas vezes se protegem seu desejo sexual no animal. Se preocupam do cheiro, dão comida a eles quando nevar. Eles salvam os nenês. Eles matam predadores, como os coiotes, um tipo de lobo. E eles até se confundem e misturam me desculpem, o mijo humano e servo em muitas práticas exóticas que eu posso detalhar na hora do bate-papo. Então, os caçadores me ensinam que os custos são muito altos. Eles alegam que a maioria de fotógrafos, de quem curte o mountain bike, né? Quem gosta de caminhar no mato, essas pessoas, com quem eu me bato, quando faço as pesquisas, sempre dizem que os caçadores são brutais. E eles muitas vezes perguntam aos caçadores e a mim, e dizem assim, por que os caçadores não podem ir comprar a carne no supermercado, como gente normal, como pessoas normais? Muitas dessas pessoas do meu tipo, quer dizer, meus colegas, meus amigos, meus parentes, minha família em Nova York, muitas dessas pessoas também indicam que a gente deveria comer muito menos carne, em nome de um mundo saudável. Em resposta, os caçadores dizem que a comida preferida do veado é a soja. E a manutenção de soja em América do Norte requer a matança contínua dos animais que vêm comer o produto dos fazendeiros. Os fazendeiros locais, onde eu faço a pesquisa, calculam que para cada hectare, para 10 hectares de soja, precisa-se matar 7 veados durante a época em que vai chegando à maturidade a soja. Na verdade, o estado de Nova Jersey providencia permissos de depredação, são chamados. Eles permitem que você mate tantos servos que você quiser a qualquer hora do dia e noite. Então, eu conversei com Luiz, um trabalhador de Guatemala, sem documentos, que agora mora no New Jersey e trabalha numa fazenda grande de maçã. Ele falou assim, o dono me manda de madrugada com a escopeta na mão e me manda abrir mão de botar chumbo nos bichos. Os antropólogos já têm pesquisado bastante o custo humano de enrolar as comunidades em projetos ambientalistas em lugares como Praia do Forte, o Arembepe, com o Projeto Tamar. Mas muito pouco tem se falado a respeito da violência escondida que muitos caçadores observam em referência a técnicas dos fazendeiros ou até na manutenção de parques públicos, como esse Pine Mountain, a Montanha dos Pinhos, que eu estou chamando o parque onde eu trabalho, onde eles procuram caçadores para acabar com os animais, para salvar a vegetação na montanha. Então, os caçadores estão botando holofotes na violência do monocrop, da agricultura industrial. Eles apontam que, ao enfrentar a morte, a pessoa se torna responsável e se comporta como um sujeito ético que cogniza o preço da morte. E isso é uma posição política que os críticos queriam preservar as florestas, preservar os animais, e supostamente escapar à violência. Eles não se dão conta do quanto que eles estão enrolados com uma violência parecida. Eles argumentam que uma independência do sistema de produção de compra de comida com dinheiro, um reconhecimento da morte que não é possível para consumidores que compram a carne no plástico no supermercado. Poucos caçadores denunciam o capitalismo como sistema, mas eles apontam com insistência momentos particulares, específicos, básicos de violência e o tanto que essa violência é necessária para a economia dos Estados Unidos. Além da crítica da carne industrial, os caçadores também apontam para a violência dos fazendeiros que empregam um guatemalteco sem documentos para sair de madrugada com a escopeta e matar os animais silvestres em nome da proteção das maçãs. O zelo para uma criança, para uma casa, para uma produção de soja, ou para um veado. Muitas vezes envolve a violência e o amor, os caçadores me avisam. Liberais, esquerditas, o que eles dizem é scumbag liberals, que seria esquerdistas de condom, de camisinha de Vênus. Eles alegam que essas pessoas, eu, não compreendem a verdadeira violência que se encontra na vida cotidiana e o sistema no qual, onde todos nós moramos. As armas, eles argumentam, não são o problema. É pessoas que não conhecem, não sabem usar corretamente as armas. Eu rejeito este argumento. E eu alego, e eu peço um controle mais forte de armas. Mas eu reconheço a importância das críticas expostas por eles, de, número 1, a produção industrial de comida. Número 2, o tanto que a alienação capitalista inclui ou precisa uma falta de possibilidade de encarar o peso da morte. Nós poderíamos pensar nisso não como um problema de luto, como nos ensina Judith Butler, mas de se responsabilizar por a morte que se deve às formas em que nós moramos. Essa última foto sou eu procurando ser como eles. Quer dizer, conhecendo a morte. Um encontro com a morte é básico para a definição do ser humano e, por isso, a diferença entre animais e gente. Os caçadores celebram a vida e a reprodução social de famílias através da matança de animais. Essa aqui é uma contradição brutal que eles reconhecem, mesmo quando se comportam de uma forma que eu acho bem brutal. Em outros momentos, eu tenho argumentado que os caçadores procuram resolver essa contradição através da distribuição de carne, de mandar os frutos da caça a várias pessoas à procura de salvação, vamos dizer. É óbvio que os caçadores, como todos nós, são muitas vezes cegos à violência da prática deles e também do impacto dessas práticas em outros seres humanos e outros animais. Eles também têm problemas ligando suas ideias bem interessantes a respeito da violência no capitalismo a uma crítica mais ampla e sistemática que fosse além de xenofobia, racismo, homofobia e discriminação da mulher. Quer dizer, eu estou dizendo que eles estão enxergando algo muito importante, que deixa eles pessoas gentis, doces, afetivas e brutais, racistas, xenofóbicas. E estou fazendo essa crítica através de um espelho que esses caçadores providenciam sobre as formas de viver da classe média alta e politicamente progressiva que fosse preservar as formas de vida dos pequenos e coitados no campo e dos animais e a natureza. Eu não vou romantizar a minha pesquisa de campo ou romantizar esses caçadores e oferecer uma apologia para movimentos nacionais políticos como esse de Make America Great, de Donald Trump. E esses movimentos ganham força, muita força, com as pessoas com quem eu trabalho. Mas eu estou tentando sugerir que a utopia particular de um grupo pequeno de pessoas morando no estado mais densamente, com a população mais densa em todos os Estados Unidos, essas tentativas de viver de outra forma não deveriam ser descontadas por intelectuais como um simples fascismo, populismo, falsa consciência ou brutalidade exercitado por pessoas problemáticas que não sabem o que é ser íntimo com o meio ambiente, os animais. A utopia deles é uma utopia onde as pessoas escapam os latifúndios através da procura pela própria comida, enquanto reconhecem que, ao se manter, eles participam na morte de outros. Ao reconhecer isso, eu não estou dando apoio à matança de animais. E eu continuo a afirmar que, politicamente, muitos dos meus colegas de caça são problemáticos. Mas eu falo isto e eu me acerco à cena de matar um animal lindo, vivo, com a compreensão nítida que nós somos todos sujeitos problemáticos. E as formas de salvar o mundo e de procurar redenção ética e individual que são professadas, que são oferecidas por meus amigos e colegas cosmopolitas da esquerda, também está cheio de violência. Não é bem a violência que nós identificamos entre os caçadores, mas, mesmo assim, é uma violência. Então, procurando uma terra em comum para sair dos problemas das duas democracias mais grandes da América Latina, maiores da América Latina, Brasil e Estados Unidos, divididos entre esquerda e direita. Eu estou oferecendo uma etnografia onde nós olhamos a produção de afeto e como é que esse afeto se circule e seja dividida e seja representada por pessoas autorizadas a representá-la, como eu, como nós aqui. E, através disso, eu proponho que talvez haja uma forma de reconhecer que nós não somos necessariamente divididas através das identidades fixas pelas quais meu país é bem reconhecido e pelos quais o Brasil, em certo momento, era reconhecido como um lugar
during a certain time period was known as a space of flux. As a Brazilian is now living in the United States, how can we take the idea of influx that is still so problematic in race relations, Brazilian race relations, in which Black people deny Blackness, trying to be something else? This flux, this hybridism was never a part of the official history of my country, but there is a flux of identity in certain moments of affection, particularly in my experience in which vis-a-vis as facing death for us human beings, where we have very intimate relationships with death, but the critique and the production of knowledge about these violences, be it killing an animal, eating its flesh, or discriminating against someone from Guatemala who's doing the dirty work, from the people who want to buy apples in my country. Yet, this critique has been developed from a perspective that excludes this class of workers and hunters to which I interact. So I'll leave you with that. I hope I haven't gone past my time. I thank you for your attention. And looking forward to debating with you. Thank you for your explanation. We are now going to have Professor Angela, who is going to debate these presentations. Professor Figueiredo. He is an associate professor at the Federal University of Recôncavo Baiano. She's got a degree in anthropology from the Federal University of Bahia. She's a master's in social sciences, and she's a doctor in sociology, and she's got a postdoctoral degree at the Virginia University in the Department of African American Studies in 2017 at Berkeley in the Department of Ethnic Studies. Her relationship with African Americans and other partnerships has reflected in her work about Black middle class and studies developed about race, or gender, and class. Professor Angela coordinates the Angela Davis Center, a group that debates issues of race, gender, and subalternity, and coordinator of the Feminist Decolonial School, and a professor at the Social Sciences Department at the Federal University of Recôncavo Baiano, and she's also teaching at interdisciplinary gender studies at the Federal University of Bahia. She's been involved in issues of debating race, gender inequalities, cultural identity, middle class movement, beauty, social movement, entrepreneurship, Black feminism. She has also organized two films, Ebony God, and she's been the organizer of the exhibit Ebony Hair, and she has coordinated courses for low-income Black people in partnership, and she's been conducting the New Elites of Color, Black middle class trajectories and profiles. In the last year, she's published articles about issues of race, gender, and feminism, organizing workshops about entrepreneurship, and writing for women. Thank you, Professor Angela. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here and to share this table with Collins and Small, Lívio, Castro, Raquel. I am not sure if I should thank for the invitation or talk about the challenge as a mediator of establishing a dialogue in two communications that are so rich. Stephen states that he wanted to make things complex simple and vice versa, and John talks about ethnography, and we feel this whole building of his argument about affection. And as he proposes that we think about the possibilities of communication and dialogue, and the possibility that as we move in different societies to the limits of a perspective that is very polarized, he states that we should look at certain practices and understand the complexities and layers within these communities. So in pondering about these issues, we have two big challenges here. These are ethnographies, and one is an ethnography and thinking about Europe. These are two papers that when we try to stitch it all together, I'm going to do what Small has suggested, thinking about similarities with Brazil. First of all, I would like to start praising and wishing comfort and overcoming to the families of over 430 made that very clear how racism then expands these inequalities, and how actually countries and the empires are placed as those that have vaccinations to actually donate. So these inequalities, even for access to vaccination, some countries are going back to normal, and the notions that we had in the beginning that the pandemics were going to bring a new relationship with nature and solidarity, it seems to have actually established and consolidated inequality, spaces of inequality. Stephen has talked about the pandemics of racism.
A ONU falou da pandemia do
Michelle Bachelet talked about feminicide as a pandemic, and we live a context in which there's an increase in racism and increase in death rates for children and feminicide. So how can we reflect? I'm taking these positive images. I want to think along with you about possibilities of turning what is complex simple and vice versa, in thinking about affection in a context in which evidently intersectionalities between gender, race, class, and nationality become more evident and more strained. During the pandemics, we know that women are more victimized, and Stephen brings this information to the United States. Black people have more probabilities of dying. The data is available online, and the probabilities of dying than a white person. And I think this is a moment in which, on one hand, we have Black women at the battlefronts as nurses, as supermarket people and domestic workers, these professions that have been so emblematic and effectively from the experience of domestic workers have been placed as evidence. Many practices that we already knew, I'm not generalizing them, but for many workers, recently there's been an article stating that some workers were made impossible to come and go because the families wanted to guarantee that they would not be exposed to coronavirus. And all of these practices leads us to think that we also have the Black Coalition for Rights to mention one of them, that these Black organizations are working in order to make available the food so that the state during this time period, these communities, there's been a lot of efforts to bring this food, and effectively how these hunters in many ways have contributed to that in thinking about these contradictions and these representations. And these are elements that bring these two groups together. I would like to evince the pandemics and feminicide. I want to evince how Black women have been victims and threatened by political feminicide, and what's been defining us as effective feminicide, which was the case of Marielle, but also threats suffered by the city hall, the mayor of Cachoeira, and Brene Bioli, a trans woman at PSOL, regardless of political parties. Therefore, women, Black women and trans Black women in this specific case in general have been the victims of threats, death threats. And how can these pandemics then expand these political frontiers of resistance for Black people, for political engagement? And what we mean that we have similar moments of assassinations of an uncle and a nephew here at a supermarket in Salvador, George Floyd's assassination gained widespread visibility in Brazil. We had a 5-year-old child, Miguel, who was the son of a domestic worker. The fatalities during the pandemics and the which are intersected from the condition of multiple gender, sexuality, and class identities. How does this tensioning take place while some of us uh, are living in isolation or socially isolating? How do we explain that a society that should be concerned with healing and cure has become so violent? So I think that's very interesting, this proposition in which he associates this notion of freedom to violence. How does violence and how does it become more intense sexual abuse, theaters for in children, on teenagers, all of that is connected. So this overloading of work, this
os países, as regiões dentro dos países, né? As regiões mais pobres têm se tornado mais pobres, e como afeta, sobretudo, as mulheres negras, de um modo geral, e as mulheres negras que estão nessa região, nas regiões mais empobrecidas do país. Então, eu quero pensar, dialogar junto com vocês como a construção de masculinidades, né? O texto do John, ele trabalha um pouco a questão da construção das masculinidades, mas chamando atenção para
drawing attention in order to think about this relationship of unhumanity. The goal here is to think it's very interesting to think about this relationship and research relationship in academic work.
Livro de não simpático, daqueles temas que, de um modo geral, a gente não gosta de fazer.
In general, we don't like to establish these connections. And my question is for John, in establishing this dialogue, is to understand if you become a hunter to perform your ethnography, or if you, as a hunter, every time we become an insider, do you visualize the space of humanity as something that is possible, that are incomplete, absent, and the notion that effectively are imperialists and fascists? How do you seek to retrieve the humanity of these agents that, from the standpoint of representations, are stereotyped as human beings? I think that my doubt is that if they are stereotyped by their political positions, and you demonstrate that even within these relationships with these undocumented people, there is a space for dialogue. It's not only a reproduction of fascism and racism, but I wanted to think about these methodological issues and these political aspects, and what you operate within a concept that, by Patricia Hill Collins, the outsider within. You are within, you are completely in, you are completely out. In terms of this humanization, what is allowed for you? And I think that our choices of research themes oftentimes generate, and I'm talking in particularly about those students at the Factory of Ideas. We've had a large number of academic reflections that surround the themes that are close to me, the themes that I have affinities with, the themes that I need to include in the untold stories. There is a story here. Black researchers, trans researchers were absent from academic production, and once we join, we want to show that side of history that hasn't been told, that insubordination, those subjects that have been silenced by history. And that's the case that was very shocking when Bolsonaro was elected, and a lot of his victories was attributed to neo-Pentecostal churches, the belief in God and obeying to their pastors. We did not know, we for many years rejected getting to know this significant portion of the population that has been converted in these churches, and where the state does not reach. You either lose their sons to the traffic, drug dealing, or you deliver them to Jesus, and their choices have been delivering them to Jesus. Our lack of affinities, our lack of affinity and empathy, we are playing an important role of telling stories that haven't been told and contributing to broadening Brazilian history from many perspectives. We are making history. On the other hand, we are not recognizing how the consequences of refuting what we don't like and what we have no tolerance for, and how that contributes to building stereotypes and crafting antipathies and crafting irreversible logics, positive logics, and this retaking this. The notion is you're either with me or against me, and of course all of that leads to building a polarity in which none of you have talked about, but social networks have a very important role in crafting these polarities. I am someone who motivates this search of diversity, but I draw attention to this craft of narratives that we build is an impossibility of dialogue. And I think that we need to be open to this dialogue. Obviously, I am very moved by John Collins' ethnography, who seeks to find the humanity of these people, though it doesn't have anything to do with me personally. And your narrative is very interesting. We want to know about their voting patterns and their dispositions. And Stephen, he established much closer contact with him in terms of his narratives, showing his imperialisms and the challenges, also in terms of representations and images.
Entendi. Então você tem
uma desigualdade that you have an inequality in the United States, and the crafting of Black images there, and the images that you showed of Barack Obama and others that go through sports and politics, and the vice president herself. So you have racialized context in which there is a production of different images, and we do not reproduce the logic, at least as you presented here, of certain ways existing in Europe, in which associations associated to what Patricia Hill Collins has defined as controlling images. These are stereotype images in which Black people are good in sports, and how that is consolidated in building an image of an incompatibility of someone who is either good in sports but not good in politics. So this political representation in which we are very little, but at the foundation of the social movement, we are a majority. How do we then think about this dichotomy, this fragmentation of an overrepresentation of the daily lives of our communities? And in this context, for my neighbor, for neighborhood association, but for politics as representation of politics, my body and my gender is not suitable or not suitable. From my experience of the Marielle Forum, that is very important because it's an important concept for Black feminism and feminism in general. My experience in all of these movements of Black women demonstrate that it is a question that has always been posed to us. How don't we have a Black representation in the city that has the largest population of African people outside of the African continent? Why don't political parties give us the same time or resources as other political candidates? Why aren't Black women chosen to be political candidates? And so that's where we take the responsibility away from Black subjects, and rather we operate within the logics of institutional policies, white heterosexual policies, moving away from that question. Yes, it's true. We don't have an explanation. It's possible to explain. So from that standpoint, I would like you to help me understand what are the reasons for this low representativity for Black people, in which there was parity between men and women in politics in Europe. And an issue that is more related to COVID, we know and we are aware of that some European countries, I don't know if they are majority, Italy and Spain, have public health services. In the United States, you don't have this availability. So the answers to COVID are going to be, is it better in the context of the pandemics to be Black in Europe than in the United States? Operating, it's better to be middle class in the United States and if you're poor in Europe. So is that still the case within the COVID context where you have, is racism there regardless? I would like to talk about the strengthening of the public health care system and those who are students who are part of private schools. They are migrating to public schools and they are migrating to the public health care system. Because when the middle class influences in general why the conception of life for middle class matters, the services have a better quality. So this migration of middle class into this public healthcare system implies, I would say, is it going to be the case? Is it going to imply post-pandemic, is it going to change? You have the taking back of economy, and the middle class then takes back its necessity of differentiation. So it's necessary to have a healthcare plan, yes. And I imagine how the pandemics may have taught us all the importance of resisting neoliberal forces and the privatization of our
O SUS, muito, muito, muito obrigada pelo debate, professora Ângela.
Thank you, Professor Angela. These were very heated questions.
breve pausa a todos de
I'm
5
going to ask you for a brief pause.
tomar uma água, reidratar. E aí voltamos para iniciar o debate com o professor Stephen Small e o professor John Collins, ok? Tá, então 5 minutinhos. Até já, pessoal. Olá, olá a todos, todas e todes, bem-vindos de volta. Espero que houve tempo para todo mundo se hidratar nessa pausa. Então, vamos começar com as provocações deixadas pela professora Ângela. E eu queria aproveitar e juntar a provocação da professora Ângela a questão duas questões que foram trazidas pela professora Patrícia Gomes e pelo colega Wellington, para o professor Small. Como o professor Small vê a questão de acesso a direitos de cidadania por parte...
How does Professor Small see the issues of access to citizenship in this Black Europe? The European experiences are different historically and not just one. And in terms of the interventions of Black people in sports in Europe, an example for the French soccer team, national team, thinking about what Angela has brought to us in terms of representations. Professor
Okay.
Smalls?
Yes, thank you very much for these questions. Thank you, Angela, for your provocations and for your thoughtfulness. We appreciate it very much. Okay, let me try to answer this question. Again, the issue is to take things that are very complicated and try to make them simple. Okay, the vast majority of Black people in the US are citizens, and the majority have been here for hundreds of years. The majority of Black people in Europe are also citizens. Racism suggests that we are not citizens, but the vast majority are citizens. However, we have not been there as long as Black people in the US. And our access to citizenship is very uneven. And to take the complex situation and make it simple, in the United Kingdom, in France, and in the Netherlands, far more Black people arrived in those countries as citizens of colonies. And also they spoke the national language, English, French, Dutch. Portugal was also this case to some extent. Okay, so people in those countries have far more access to citizenship. There are still a lot of Black people in those countries that don't have access, but they are more recent. And that access is increasingly being closed because of Fortress Europe and because of Brexit. However, if you look at Black people in places like Spain, and especially in Italy, then you see access to citizenship is far more difficult. So I have colleagues in Italy like Camila Hawthorne and Kwanzaa Musa dos Santos, and they provide evidence that even for Black people born in Italy, it's very difficult to get citizenship, especially if your parents were not born in Italy, because you need to provide so much documentation. It costs so expensive. You need to document every address you lived at, that there are thousands of Black people born in Italy who do not have citizenship. Okay, so their struggle and the emphasis on citizenship is far more important than the emphasis in the UK. So these are the problems of citizenship. Another dimension is the sexism of the European social formation. The assumption is that white women or citizens in Europe who marry Black men, they do it so because they have been tricked or they have been deceived. Okay, and it's also far more difficult for women of color to go to Europe and acquire citizenship because they are stereotyped as prostitutes, as illiterate, as victims of trafficking. So again, these issues are common to Europe, but they're uneven across the different nations. So citizenship, of course, is necessary in order to commence fights, in order to struggle for far better resources. And I was at a conference with some Black people in Italy, and they said that they don't have documents, but there are also a lot of white people who do not have documents. But the police harass the Black people because of racism, and they leave the white people. Also, when I lived in Spain, there are black people selling goods on the street and white people, and the police chased the black people. And then the black guy in Italy, he said, look, they don't arrest us because they don't want us in prison and to pay, but they just disturb us and disrupt our lives. So citizenship is a major issue. And again, I say it's uneven across the country. Now, with regard to the question of football, I'm not sure I entirely understand it, but let me try to answer in this way. The question of black men playing soccer again reveals the hypocrisy, the ambivalence, and the racism of Europeans. So on the one hand, there is extensive discrimination. Let's use the case of France. Extensive discrimination against black people. It's very well documented, even though the government denies it. And yet, when you have so many black people in the soccer team and they win the World Cup, then suddenly they become French. Suddenly they become French. And a lot of people have commented on this and said, you know, this is part of the racism. And when the French team was competing in the World Cup, several African people said, this is wonderful. Africa is winning the World Cup for France. And one of the French ministers went on TV. He said, these people are not African. They are French. And the people said, but you don't treat us like French. So again, the example is in soccer. There's other examples in sports. So this is the continued ambivalence, the continued, let's call it, hypocrisy. So that's how I would answer those questions. If you'll permit me, let me try to address the question from Angela. Angela had many questions, many intersections. And again, let me try to take something complex and try to make it simple. One of Angela's questions was, how do we gain more access to resources, more access to power, more access to political power? She mentioned Brazil. I can't comment on that case. But in terms of Europe, in terms of the US, here's what I say. There is no global solution to the global problem of racism. There is no general solution, because although there are general problems, there are different instances. What happens in California, in New York, in Massachusetts is different from Mississippi, from Oklahoma. In Europe, what happens in the UK, in France is different from Spain. So although they are general problems, the local contexts are different. How many black people? What is the most important issue? Is it citizenship? Is it sexism? Is it providing women with opportunities for childcare? These issues must be decided, I believe, locally, depending on the local priorities and depending on the local social formation, the local organization. Now, what did I want to say? Okay, another issue for me is black people do not have the resources. We continue to protest, to organize, to demonstrate. And we are told we're only doing it for black people, but we are making society better for everyone. Black people are mobilizing, making society better for everyone. And Europe is better because of black people. The United States is better because of black people. Okay, so then that raises the question that we have a lot in common with white people. And I think this was implied or made explicit in John's presentation. So where do we build alliances? And my view is black people should continue to do what we've always done, which is mutual support in families, in communities, and in organizations. But I don't believe that we will achieve true equality or we will truly reduce inequality unless we build alliances. And black people have different views about whether they're going to develop multiracial alliances. My final point is this. We've spoken mainly about black people, but in California and in the US, as you know, there's been a lot of more explicit anti-Asian racism. Trump talked about the Chinese virus. There have been attacks on Asian people, particularly in California. So this to me raises the question that, of course, the world is not divided into black and white. There are different racial groups. There are different ethnic groups. There are different religious groups. So I'd just like us to think about how do we think about alliances with other groups of different ethnic or national positions. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, professor Small. Aqui temos uma outra pergunta do professor Felipe Fernandes, que também...
We have another question here coming from that group up with the next question.
Ele fala, aqui em São Félix temos muitos caçadores também.
Here in St. Felix, we have many hunters,
Dizem que é lazer, mas é também
and they claim this is leisure.
Tatu e jiboia, que são animais típicos. Mas esses caçadores são majoritariamente de
But
esquerda.
these hunters are majority left-wing, meaning these are aligned with ideals of left-wing parties. And our understanding of this generalization then, the question is for John. So what is the world that these hunters dream about? And then bringing what Angela has brought forth when she talked about a thought in which she talked about how this middle class does not want to unlink from the past and refuses to debate ideas about the future. So I wanted to connect these two questions.
Bom, William, muito obrigado. Muito obrigado a todos, mas muito obrigado, William, pela forma que você juntou.
Thank you for William for the way you have connected these two questions.
Quanto às excelentes indagações de Angela, né?
And I thank you also, Angela, for your questions. Yes, this is exactly what I meant. I was writing an article with a friend
chamado Bad Subjects, sujeitos ruins, né? Sujeitos
bad subjects.
Não simpáticos em vez de dizer antipáticos, mas às vezes antipáticos.
Oftentimes unpleasant. And Professor Smalls, he really helped us think,
tornar o complexo menos complexo. Ele usa duas palavras.
Making what is complex less complex.
E aliança, né?
And in terms of building alliances. So basically what I'm trying to do here is to imagine before the political formation, more concretely speaking, in which we may have then an introduction of an alliance about what's different in politics before coming to exactly in terms of ambivalences and liminal spaces in which hunters judge other people for being women or lesbian woman or a black woman or a white man, but if they're good in hunting, killing animals, they are the same for that moment. So for me, this is a contradiction. Facing a basic violence that nobody denies, building ties that are very distinct with the possibility of adding and making those realities or those alliances real and turning to the question I am going to address Felipe in more empirical terms so that deepening the notions of Angela, this issue is that, for example, how blacks
na
have
nação.
never been included
Só que a
in
mitologia
the
da nação
nation,
se
but the
constrói através
mythology
deles,
of
ao redor
nation
deles.
is built
Quer dizer, é
around
uma
them.
representação,
So it's
representação
a
ideológica
representation, the
de que essa
ideological
classe trabalhadora
representation
seja
that
o
this
nato,
working
o
class
coração dos Estados Unidos.
has
Jamais
the
é,
heart of the United
mas
States.
eles
It has
se
never
acham.
been, but they
Então,
feel that way. So
ideologicamente, as ferramentas que
ideologically,
eles têm
the tools
são
that
as
they
mesmas
use
ferramentas
are
dos
the
donos do
same tools
poder.
by
Eles querem
used by
abolir
those who own
o
power.
mercado,
They
a
are a symbol
liberdade,
of a
as
market
armas,
of freedom,
a
of
xenofobia,
guns, of xenophobia,
como o básico da
as
resposta
the
ao
basic
fato
of
de que eles
answer
sabem que não
to
são
the
incluídos.
fact that they know they are
Mas
not
têm
the
que ser
same.
incluídos porque
But
tudo
they
que
need to
aprendem
be
é que são
included
eles.
because what they
Isso que
learn
permite
is that it's
que eles
them, and that's
imaginem que
what
o Barack
allows
Obama
them to
vá
imagine
tomar o
that
lugar
Barack
deles,
Obama
de que
is going to take
guatemalteco
their
vá
place,
tomar o
that
lugar
some
deles. E
Mon
aí a
from
política
Guatemala is
é
going to
Make
take their
America
place.
Great
And then
Again. A política
the
é
politics
do
is to
passado, né?
have
É de um passado que jamais
making
existiu. As
American
pessoas
great
costumam
again,
dizer
a
que a
past
América
that
nunca
has
foi
never
great para certos
existed, because
sujeitos políticos.
some people
Isso é
argue
verdade.
that America has never been
Mas a
great.
América também
But
foi
we
great
also
para
know
esses
that it's
caçadores
been great for these
somente na
hunters
ideologia.
only
Isso não
in
quer dizer
ideologies,
que a
meaning
polícia mate eles
if
como
the
mata
police
aos negros. Isso
kills
não
them
quer dizer
as
que eles
much as they
sofram
kill white people,
de falta de
that
acesso à
doesn't mean
saúde e
a lack
como
of
os
access to
negros.
health
Não estou
care
dizendo
and
isso,
how
mas estou dizendo que,
black people,
de certa
but what
forma,
I mean
eles
is
estão
that to a
metidos numa
certain extent
contradição
they
de
have a
se
contribution
pensarem
of
incluídos enquanto
thinking
jamais foram
of
incluídos,
themselves
mas de
as
uma forma
included
diferente de outros grupos.
while they have never been.
Isso implica o que eu estou tentando fazer
So
como
that
intelectual
implies,
da
I
esquerda,
mean,
da capital,
as a left-wing
da
intellectual,
antropologia, é pegar aquele momento de
taking
ambivalência,
that
como diz o
moment
professor
of
Small, né?
ambivalence
Antes de chegarmos a identidades mais fixas, e empregá-la como um
and
momento de
employ them
educação.
as a moment,
Aí é
an
o momento que
educational
podemos
moment.
educar.
That's the moment
Quando
when we can
Black Lives
provide
Matter
education.
se bate
When
com
Black Lives
a
Matter
Associação dos
debate
Caçadores do
with
Nordeste
the
de Nova
Hunters
Jersey,
Association in
vai ter conflito.
northeastern
Ou não vai ter acordo.
New
Mas
Jersey,
se
there will
alguém quer
be no
participar
agreement.
nos dois
But if
grupos,
anybody
se
wants to
bate
participate in both groups,
a abater servo
killing a deer and distributing the meat
e se
together
convidarem para ir nas casas,
and inviting
há possibilidade de
to each
diálogo.
other's homes, there is a possibility of
Então,
dialogue.
mas há
Hence,
grande problema. Isso aqui é a minha resposta
there is a problem here, and that's
Dr.
the
Fernandes.
answer to
O que
Fernandes,
que os
Dr.
caçadores querem?
Fernandes. What
Eles
do
querem
they
respeito,
want? They want
querem
respect.
ser deixados em paz
They want to
para
be
fazer
left
as
alone
maluquices deles.
to do their
Os
madness.
Estados Unidos é um país desse, né? E você comprar 4 carros, quebrar todos os 4 carros, ficar aí no meio do mato,
If you want to break
tomar,
buy 4
matar,
cars and
explorar,
break
estou
them and
exagerando,
kill
mas é,
and do
eles querem
whatever,
ser deixados em paz.
they want to be left alone.
Querem o que eles chamam de bom comportamento.
They
É
want what
respeito
they call respect and
entre
good behavior
pessoas, famílias e
among
grupos.
families and groups.
Isso, e eles, mas o problema é que eles querem controlar a esfera
But
pública.
the problem is that they want to control the
Eles
public
não
sphere.
aceitam a diferença na esfera pública, né?
They
Isso
don't
me
accept
torna de-
difference in
me
the public
devolve,
sphere, and that
torna
gives me back
essa ideia
to
de que eles
this
se acham
notion
no
that
centro do
they
país
feel like
ideologicamente.
they are the center of the country from an
Isso,
ideological
Aí eles
standpoint,
não toleram
and they
nenhuma
do not
ameaça
tolerate
do
any
outro
threat
nessa esfera
from
pública que a
others
esfera
in
pública dos Estados Unidos
this
é
public
muito
sphere,
romantizada, mas é diferente de
because
que
the public
da
sphere
esfera
in the
pública
United
no
States
Brasil, né? Tem
is
papel,
very
a gente não
romanticized,
precisa aceitar o trabalho
but
totalmente
it's
de Roberto da Mata, mas tem papel diferente na
different.
pública,
It has a
na
different role
política.
for everything.
Então, não sei se isso
Hence,
aí
I
começa
don't
o
know
debate, mas
if
eu
that
agradeço
starts the
bastante
debate
a interrogação de todos, porque realmente me fez pensar isto de uma forma
because that has
pouco
made me
diferente.
think about it in different ways.
Obrigado, professor. E é sobre isso, né? Esse momento de trocas, expandir e pensar junto.
So
Tem uma
this is
pergunta
the
para a professora Ângela.
moment of exchange, and I have a question
Ângelo Pelembe para a
for
professora
Angela.
Ângela. Ele pergunta, existe um
He
partido cuja
asks,
base
is there
social
a party
é negra ou camponesa no Brasil? Se
for,
não, por quê?
and why not?
Pelo menos os partidos de esquerda, que eu de direita eu não conheço, a base é negra.
And at least the left-wing parties that I know,
Rede, a base é negra.
we have the network
As lideranças
and
dos
the
candidatos
leadership
são
and
negras,
the
mas a
candidates
base,
might not be black,
E
but
movimento
the
de rua,
bases are
os
the
famosos
homeless
cabos eleitorais. O que a gente está querendo é
movement,
exatamente
those who
mudar isso.
support
sim, sim,
political
professora.
candidates. That's what we
E
are trying
também
to
uma
change.
questão que o pessoal se debruça pouco ao olhar o movimento é
And the
enxergar que eram
question
os
that was
trabalhadores
also asked here
negros da década de 20 e 30
has
que
to
estavam
do with
construindo, né, essas mobilizações.
this mobilization.
Escuta, deixa eu perguntar a respeito disso. Tem a ver com porque é meu tempo fora da Bahia, né? O Felipe fala dos caçadores que são da esquerda de Cachoeira, e Ângela falou agora sobre a importância da ruptura do clientelismo, né? E a base e através isso aí é algo que acho que o PT mudou nos últimos 20 anos, né?
That the Workers' Party
Porque
has changed in these last years
a maioria dos
because when I
caçadores
was
que eu conhecia, eu não vou dizer
the
que estava em
majority
Cachoeira,
of
mas no
hunters
sertão,
in the
apoiava
hinterlands
a ACM,
supported
né?
ACM.
A ACM. Isso
They
é a
were
revolução
loyal
da
to
ruptura
ACM. And
na
there's
política
been a
da Bahia.
rupture
A capital
in politics in
apoiava
Bahia.
Lídice da Mata,
The
por
capital
exemplo, né?
was supporting Lídice da
E
Mata,
aí se elegeu
and she has
4 vezes a
been
ACM
elected
por causa do
4
voto do
times.
interior. Então,
And ACM was
agora,
bringing votes from the interior. So,
pensando isso, você
and thinking
a
about that,
resposta que eu escutei é que
the
a
answer that I
base
heard is that
desses
the basis
é uma base
for
negra.
these
Eu
parties
queria
is
só
a black.
mente compreender historicamente a sua visão dessa mudança. Se eu estiver
Have
errado, né?
a vision about this
Mas
change.
eu não
If
acredito
I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong, but
surgiu como uma cidade, partido com
I don't want to
isso foi
think
justamente
about
por
the
causa
Workers'
do
Party as
movimento negro.
a
Não sei se eu estou
foundation of a black foundation. I
minha burrice,
hope
realmente.
I'm making sense. I think there is a difference between the basis itself and the basis. One thing is the basis is sustaining racial inequality as much as gender were not incorporated in the party. We have subjects and black bodies, but the debate about inequalities was not incorporated in the party. So who makes this process? That doesn't mean that we don't have a large body of black people, but this question was not fundamental for the party because there is a difference between the incorporation of a debate about racial inequalities and racism. These are not similar things. In many churches, we have a black foundation, but the debate about racism is coming through youth. In neo-Pentecostal churches, for example, black elements of black cultures were demonized. So there's a black an awareness of racial inequality and blackness are two distinct elements. The issue of hunters, I could not imagine the notion that I have about hunters are stereotyped as much as I cannot imagine the hunters that voting on Joe Biden, on Kamala Harris. So the crafting of a masculinity and the value of human life and strength and virility and courage are extremely male core values. You haven't talked about the representation of the role of women for these hunters, but I believe that all identities are built in this notion of masculinities and elements that they consider to be happy. And I'm not sure what they think about women, but I cannot imagine them voting on women, voting for women. So if you're talking about strengthening these elements that are understood as important for male identity, I cannot see these hunters voting for someone like Lidsi da Mata. So this debate about the incorporation that politics is a male space, because the images that we see are male, this is what's coming to the fore now. Why? Though we are a majority, we are in social movements, in neighborhood associations, but we do not elect a majority of women because it has to do with resources and choices and political logics more than with the masses that votes and do not vote. The political choices then seem to be individual, but they are not.
Obrigado, professora Ângela. Temos só mais uma pergunta, já estamos encerrando, porque o nosso teto é às 14h30.
We are wrapping up, so we have one more question. I would like to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Another question that I have, that I am going to then say that I disagree that both the right and left wing are problematic, but the land titling for Maroon communities, shouldn't we mention that? Glorifying this land titling, I think that we don't have this glorification of these territories, because these are territories of original peoples, of terreiro people. They are always in dispute. And those of you, would you like to comment on that question?
Não sei, eu vou talvez chamar um pouco de diálogo com o professor.
Perhaps I'm going to ask for a dialogue in thinking, particularly in the current context. I don't know if we should talk about these types of considerations about the left as we experience the expansion of the right-wing parties, forces, recognizing what has been achieved. The Workers' Party has titled not enough land but Maroon communities, but the agrarian reform was not promoted, because that goes to show us the example in the United States in which we believed that when Barack Obama won, is that the United States was going to live a post-racial world. Wow, it wasn't possible for one person to transform structural structures, because I think Steve and John could talk about that, recognizing what has been achieved. And I think that recognizing public institutions that have placed a number of white people in Maroon communities at universities, it needs to be recognized. And the Workers' Party did that. And the other thing is that, does it wrap things up? No, because the labor market, education is important for access to the labor market, creating political awareness, creating new sensibilities. I'm not going to reduce university presence at institutions of higher learning to social assemblies. We worked very little with that. So access to institutions of higher learning and access to the labor markets, there is a ditch there. Hence, inequalities remain. So we have reached our conclusion.
Uma outra pergunta para o professor Small, mas já foi respondido no seu
So
enunciado.
the question has been addressed,
A pergunta do Denilson era sobre os
and the
novos
question was
formatos
about the new
sociais
formats to
contemporâneos,
combat
realidade,
racist practices in contemporary days, but Professor Steven has talked about these strategies for alliances, and I think that for now it's been a rich debate and rich exchanges. I would like to thank you for following us. Thank Professor John and Stephen and Angela, Professor Raquel for her translation, AGS for making this meeting possible. We will return to our 10 a.m. time slot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Obrigado. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Angela, for doing a marvelous job of pulling together very different discourses. And
Thank you,
Obrigada a
Angela.
vocês, obrigada a
Thank you, William.
vocês, obrigada à Fábrica de Ideias, obrigada a William, obrigada a
Bye.
Livre.
thank you, William. Thank you, Raquel.
Thank you, Lilio.
Obrigado.
Thank you,
Obrigado a
Raquel, querida de
todos.
sempre. A gente tá ao vivo ou já saiu?
Não, estamos ao vivo, mas o pessoal está saindo. So, thanks, Steve. Thanks, John.
Thanks,
Obrigado a
Steve.
todo mundo. It was marvelous. Much better than what I imagined.